this is the 60th anniversary writing series for the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. I am Twyla Tardif. I am professor of psychology and the Kenneth G. Lieberthal and Richard R. Rogel Professor of Chinese Studies. And I am very, very pleased to introduce to us today Peter Ho Davies, who is the Charles Baxter Collegiate Professor of English Language and Literature at the University of Michigan in the Helen Zell Creative Writing Program. He will be talking today and reading from Fortunes, a set of novels or novellas that won the Anisfield Wolf Award and was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Professor Davies is also known for his other work, The Welsh Girl, his recently published work on editing, and many, many others. He was raised in Coventry, England, and studied physics originally at Manchester University and then English at Cambridge University before coming to the United States to study in the Graduate Creative Writing Program at Boston University. He's taught at many programs, including the University of Oregon, the Emory University, and as I mentioned, currently a professor in the Helen Zell MFA program in creative writing at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Professor Davies is a recipient of numerous fellowships, including from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. His short fiction has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, and the Paris Review, and has been widely anthologized. I have to say that this novel has deep personal meaning for me and many of the friends that I know, and reading it at this time and rereading it at this time has brought me a lot of insight and deep thoughts about the experiences that we've all been going through with respect to race and identity and culture. And I'm going to quote from the novel. It's actually from the section of the novel. It's broken into 3 parts, and I keep calling it a novel, but it's a collection of novellas that make up an interesting whole that I will be asking you about later. And the part that I'm going to read from is from the Vincent Chin section of the book, Fortunes, that is something that hits close to home. For those of you who were not around at the time, it was an awful case of anti-Asian racism in the Southeast Michigan area. And the quote just goes like this: "The thing about racism, I always think, the worst thing, okay, it's not that someone has made up their mind about you without knowing you, based on the color of your skin, the way you look, some preconception. The worst thing," and this is the part that really gets under my skin, "the worst thing is that they might be right. Stereotypes cling if they have a little truth. They sting by the same token." This quote couldn't bother me more because stereotypes hurt all of us, and yet we carry them around with us every single day. I'm going to, without further ado, give up the stage to a much more eloquent person. Peter Ho Davies, please share with us all your deep, wonderful writing on identities, mixed identities, confused identities, and an incredible character in American history, Anna May Wong. Thank you. Oh, sorry, one thing. Little bit of housekeeping. Please participate in our Q&A section by typing in your questions. And then one other thing is that if you have not yet read this book, and I strongly recommend that you do. Literati has ordered some extra copies of it, and they are very happy to have you come by and purchase it locally. You can order copies through the links that are provided in today's, I believe it's in the chat or Q&A section for you to go ahead and order. Thank you.
Thank you, Twyla, for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And to Carol for organizing this great event. I really appreciate the support from the Lieberthal-Rogel Center. And it's a real honor to be here as well. So I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to share with you guys. That was actually an extremely eloquent introduction, Twyla, and I'm going to struggle to top that, I have a feeling. I feel like when I hear a lovely introduction like that, I feel like I want to quit while I'm ahead and go home, but I'll do my best. I'm going to read a section from the novel that, as Twyla was beginning to suggest, touches on the Chinese-American actress Anna May Wong, whose career sort of bridges the silent era into the 30s. She's sort of essentially the first Chinese-American movie star, and a really interesting and troubled representational figure as a result of that. This section is told in short vignettes. It hops around a little bit in time, but just to give people a way of navigating this as they're listening into it, essentially the large part of the narrative is about a journey she takes by ship back to China, or in fact, in her case, to China for the first time, to do a sort of publicity tour. And hopefully the reading will clarify the context of that as we go forward. But it also touches on different aspects and periods in her career as well. Okay, well, here we go. This section is called Your Name in Chinese. In 1926, after the first spadeful of earth was turned with a golden shovel, she had the honor of driving the first rivet in Grauman's Chinese theater. She'd starred alongside one of the theater's backers, Douglas Fairbanks, in The Thief of Baghdad 2 years earlier. In yellowing press clippings, she can be seen posing for photographers with a ball-peen hammer perched jauntily on her shoulder as if it were a golf club or parasol. Chink, chink, some wag joked after she struck the first symbolic blows. The next day, the caption in Variety called her a riveting beauty. She was 21 years old. She bought her first movie ticket at 10 with the tips she earned making deliveries for her father's laundry. This was Los Angeles, Lausanne in Chinese, her birthplace. Cutting school, she walked for miles in the heat to avoid being seen by anyone she knew. Only when she hadn't passed another Chinese face for blocks did she duck into a theater. The ticket seller gave her a narrow look, inspected the Indian head on the coin she held out as if it were a passport, this when Nickelodeons still cost a nickel, and waved her through. The ticket stub is preserved on the inside cover of her scrapbook. At first, she felt self-conscious being the only Chinese and a young girl at that in the audience. She hid in the bathroom, terrified and lonely, tracing the pattern on the tin ceiling until she heard the organist start up, and then she slipped in and took a seat. But in the cool darkness, she found herself relaxing, laughing with the rest at the short subjects, weeping with everyone else during the feature, emotions she would never have betrayed on the street, and which even here she glanced around furtively before giving vent to. But no one was watching her, all their faces upturned toward the screen, each one lit with the same silvery glaze. No one, not even she, could tell the difference. It was the first place she felt like an American. She kept going, sometimes seeking out movie houses so far from home that the intertitles were in Spanish. Pearl White in the serial The Perils of Pauline was a favorite, perils which included villains called Wu Fang and Long Sin. Her own villainy included forging notes from her father to give to her teachers in an English he couldn't write, getting whipped first by him and then by them when discovered. In the beginning, it was the theater's thrill of invisibility that she craved, that she couldn't get enough of, tired as she was of being stared at in the street, picked on in school. Outside, even the sun seemed to glare at her. Inside, it was all chill shadows. The flickers were the one place she didn't feel watched, the one place where she could watch others. Later, though, she came to envy those faces and figures on the screen before her. Not to be stared at was one thing, but to be stared at as they were stared at was something else again. She wanted to be like them. Every face on the screen was white, but in the dreaming darkness, anything seemed possible. At home, in the mirror, she practiced their expressions and poses awkwardly, but in the dark, she made their faces her own. She turns heads on the boat deck. She turns heads on the Lido deck, reclining beside the saltwater pool. It's 1935. She signs autographs in the beauty shop, at the soda fountain, and at the bar. Orientally yours, she writes, and then her name, Anna May Wong in English, and in Chinese, Wong Liu Song. She's the only Chinese in the first cabin. She turns heads at the captain's table. She turns heads in the salon. The ballroom is as big as a soundstage. Men scramble to pull out chairs for her. A woman in furs is reading The Good Earth on the promenade deck. Would she sign it? A passing steward proffers a pen. She pushes up her sunglasses, fogged with salt rime. I heard Pearl Buck wanted you for the part, the woman says, and she nods as if this matters. Good earth, better sea, she inscribes gaily on the flyleaf. The ship is the SS President Hoover, named for the 31st president, a one-time manager of the Chinese Engineering and Mining Corps. Mr. Hoover served honorably in the defense of Tianjin during the Boxer Rebellion. Later, he helped ship 50,000 coolies to South American mines. It is said the President and First Lady spoke in Mandarin in the White House whenever they wanted to communicate privately. Their portrait hangs over the grand staircase of the steamliner. Out of Honolulu, she visits Steerage and finds it filled with Chinese, stacked in bunks, many of them old, their faces freckled and pouchy, on their way home after a lifetime away. She tells them she is visiting her father, who moved back to his ancestral village, and they smile toothlessly, nod in approval. They are bringing home treasures. They show her radios, bicycles, wristwatches. They show her the prized canaries they are bringing as gifts for family, the birds cowering mutely on their perches like their owners on the edge of their bunks. Through the hull, she can just make out the dull reports of first-class passengers shooting skeet off the stern. One younger man clutches a box tightly to his chest, and when she asks what's in it, he tells her the bones of his father. She signs their autographs, but omits the orientally yours. Later, alone in her suite deluxe, she sips her nightcap, lies back on satin pillows plumped by the maid, loses herself in the lustrous grain of the burled inlaid ceiling. Wong Liu Song means frosted yellow willow. Her father asked her once what Anna May meant. Me, she said simply. Her father still remembered the excursion buses, horse-drawn and open-topped, that had toured Chinatown at the start of the century. Sightseers in straw skimmers led by a talker with a horn for a mouth, calling, "Looky here, looky there," directing their attention hither and thither, earning them the name rubbernecks. It was a racy fad, she learned later, a vogue started in San Francisco and New York that had spread to Los Angeles, driven by exotic photographs and the seamy, salacious reputation of Chinatown. Yet as a child, she never believed her father's stories. A man with a horn coming out of his mouth? She pictured a single arcing tusk like an elephant's. Besides, and almost as improbably, when were Chinese so interesting to whites? She wasn't sure they were so interesting to her, even. But at 11, she'd spotted a crowd on a street corner presided over by a man with a megaphone. The horn her father referred to was a speaking trumpet, of course, and hurried up to see if the rubbernecks had returned, only to find it was a movie crew. She tarried to watch the stars emerge from their parked limousines for a take and then retreat back to the curtained splendor of their gleaming automobiles. The leading lady, Mae Murray, from whom she would later adopt part of her English name, wore a fur, shrugging it daintily on and off her shoulders between takes like a cape. Within 2 months, already tall for her age, she had begun to model fur coats herself in newspaper advertisements for a customer who'd been impressed by her posture when she delivered laundry. She tried to give money to her father, but he didn't like the pose she struck. A disgrace, he called her. Have you no shame? She once told an interviewer she changed the spelling from M-A-E to M-A-Y to give myself permission. Permission for what? Why, everything. Within 3 years, she would receive her first screen credit. A credit to your race, he called it, in Marshall Neeland's melodrama, Bits of Life. She was 16. Neeland, 15 years older, would be her first lover. He told her he would leave his wife for her, but when he did, it was to marry the silent star, Blanche Sweet. He was just the first of many who deserted her. Men, she used to toast sardonically, they're just so damned scrutable. She styled herself a flapper in beaded dresses and cloche hats. Bobbed hair became her trademark, and the skinny, boyish silhouette, she was 5'7", a tennis player, suited her small chest. In the lingo of the day, she was the monkey's eyebrows, the kitten's ankles, the goat's whiskers, the duck's quack, the cat's particulars. A tomato, a biscuit, a sheba, the daub, the berries, the limit. With her keen chassis and swell stilts, she could dance the Charleston, and how. The trick was applying rouge to your knees. A dapper was a flapper's father. Prohibition was all wet. She would come home ossified, spifflicated, oiled and owled, and her father, the gimlet, that Airedale, would scream at her to talk American. Oh, for the love of Mike, says you. Who this Mike, he demanded. Her second lover, the director Todd Browning, was 25 years her senior, a father time in the parlance. She called him Daddy, told him his whisk broom tickled. He was good in the feathers, but he had a fire bell at home and refused to drop the pilot. It was all balled up. She once said she went a decade without having to light her own cigarettes, but she was never a gold digger, nor goofy for any 49ers, the male equivalent. Her many admirers she dismissed as grubbers and duds, pikers and pills, high johns and hoppers. Men were divided into cake eaters and corn shredders, Smith brothers, hip hounds and flat wheelers. She was nobody's blue serge. Engagement rings were handcuffs, marriage was a line. To be given the high hat in the jargon was to be snubbed. In the end, her father was only persuaded to let her appear in The Thief of Baghdad when Douglas Fairbanks came to the laundry and said he'd personally chaperone her on set. Doug called her a modest little person and even promised to lock her in her dressing room between takes. Her father believed him, she was sure. He could no more imagine his daughter taking a white lover than himself. At night, through the slit blinds of the hotel window, the new sign in the hills flashed steadily above the palms. Hollywood land. Her land, she thought fiercely. What is it, love? Hollywood, she giggled, turning into Doug's chest. In bed, he called her the chink in my amour. On set, he liked to twirl the key to her dressing room on his finger. His wife and founding partner in United Artists, Mary Pickford, was known as America's sweetheart, Blondie Locks. Her real name is Gladys, Doug whispered around his cigarette. You couldn't even pronounce mine, she scolded him. It's hard to be a leading lady without leading men, and there were no Asian leading men. But over a 30-year career, she worked on stage and screen and radio in the US, England, and Germany with Douglas Fairbanks, Laurence Olivier, Orson Welles, and Lon Chaney, man of 1,000 faces. She made a short with Laurel and Hardy and played vaudeville with Jack Benny. Alfred Hitchcock once threw a pie in her face. She taught Myrna Loy how to use chopsticks. She met Sinclair Lewis, Zora Neale Hurston, Somerset Maugham, and Walter Benjamin, who described her hair let down as like a dragon romping in water. She stayed at the Algonquin at the same time as Gertrude Stein. She taught Constance Talmadge how to use chopsticks. Man Ray took her portrait. Cecil Beaton photographed her for Vanity Fair. Her supposed lovers included Fairbanks, Vincent Price, Todd Browning, Marlene Dietrich, and Leni Riefenstahl. Men and women, all white. She taught Loretta Young how to use chopsticks. When rumored to be engaged to the Korean contract player Philip Arndt, she said kissing him was like kissing her brother. She never married. It would have been illegal for her to marry a white under California's anti-miscegenation laws. The only happiness is with one's own race, she affirmed in interviews. She taught Rene Adore how to use chopsticks. Chinese in movies aren't inscrewable, she lamented dryly. They're unscrewable. But in life, the ban on mixed marriage made her the perfect mistress, one who could never expect to wed her lovers. Turned down for the role of a lifetime. Oland in The Good Earth, a Chinese female lead. How many of those will she ever see? Turned down, moreover, for a white actress. It's a public humiliation, a famous snub, a loss of face she's still Chinese enough to think. She'd been tipped for the role in the press for years, born to play it, they said. It was what she'd been waiting for all this time, but she'd known she wouldn't get it as soon as they cast Paul Mooney, Scarface himself, in the lead. The Hays Code forbade depictions of love between the races, even when white actors were playing in yellowface. You're just not the type, was how producer Irving Thalberg explained it to her in awkward apology. You're too Chinese. The part went instead to the German actress Louise Rainier. At parties, she made light of it. The role of a lifetime? Horse feathers. Besides, she added coquettishly, isn't that what Doug Fairbanks used to promise all the girls? The role of a lifetime? It wasn't true then either. But a public humiliation requires a public response, which is why she's sailing to China. If she can't have the role of a lifetime, she'll take the trip of a lifetime, a visit to the homeland she's never set foot in. Her father has moved back 2 years earlier after selling up, and her plan is to meet him in the family village. He has never approved of her career. It's hard to escape the suspicion that he left the US to get away from her notoriety, and their estrangement was cemented when she failed to return from New York, where she was appearing on Broadway for her mother's funeral 5 years ago. She had fought for her sister to be her understudy. She balked at a yellow-faced standby, but if they had both attended the burial, the theatre would have gone dark. The show must go on, she'd told herself tearfully. Now, as she circles the deck, she's hoping for a prodigal's return of sorts, a reconciliation. But she also has another vindication in mind. She's arranged for her visit to be filmed for Hearst Metrotone News. If she can't star in The Good Earth, she'll star in her own movie, and perhaps along the way remind audiences of the real China, not the Hollywood version. A cameraman has been assigned to meet her in Shanghai and accompany her on her travels for the purpose. The show will go on. Her cameraman films her coming down the gangway in her mink. When he emerges from behind the lens to wind the camera, she sees he's in his 30s, handsome. Hat pushed back, neat pencil moustache, dark, double-breasted suit. Good linen, she thinks approvingly. His name, he tells her, is also Wong. He has to lean close and shout over the cheers of the crowd, the answering blast of the ship's whistle. He smells richly of hair oil. She gives him her hand. Mr. Wong. Hi Sheng, he says, but you can call me Newsreel. They all do. Newsreel Wong. He explains how his bureau chief had called his hotel once to find him, but hadn't remembered or known how to pronounce his name, and after that it stuck. He's thinking of having it changed legally. A stage name for a cameraman, she thinks. Whatever next? What does that make me, she drolls. Hollywood Wong? Film star Wong? But he's already filming again, the camera between them covering his face. Well, all right, she tells him. Newsreel it is. She prefers it to Mr. Wong anyway. Too much room for confusion there. Already in her very first interview, a few enterprising reporters had come out to the ship by launch the night before to make their deadline. She's been asked about her love life. She only shrugged, demurred. I'm married to my art. But the story that greets her on landing says she's accompanied on her trip by her beloved husband, Arthur. Newsreel films her at the Yew Gardens, framed by a moon gate. He films her on the Nanking Road, shopping and turning heads. He films her on the Bund, pointing out junks, rubbing the paws of the bronze lion outside the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank for luck. There are more cars than she expected, more telephones, more streetlights, a pair of trams cross in front of her, parting like curtains. She marvels blithely at the modernity. Why, it reminds me of Berlin. I was expecting old Cathay, but it looks nothing like Grauman's theatre. Mostly, though, there are more Chinese than she ever imagined. Compradors in tang jackets, black and white armors, monks in their yellow robes, crowding everywhere. More than she's ever seen. And this she keeps to herself. Secretly, she feels like an extra again, is glad of her chic Western wardrobe, Chanel suits, for helping her stand out. The Mayfair Mannequin Academy of New York named her the world's best-dressed woman in 1934. Not bad for a laundryman's daughter, she wrote her father at the time, but he didn't reply. Newsreel's IMO camera runs for 20 seconds, fully wound, and she begins pacing her movements to his rhythm. From the taxi to the hotel lobby, 20 seconds. Greeting a fan, 20 seconds. Admiring a bolt of silk, 20 seconds, and then it's time to change the reel. She feels as if he's winding her up like a tin toy. Finally, she leans on a rail overlooking the river, waiting for him, and when he raises up, she lifts her own Leica to take a picture of him. You look like a tourist, he tells her, and she frowns. On the Wangpu, the sails of junks unfurl like fans, raised as if in modesty. She outfits herself with a new wardrobe. She sheds her Western dresses and suits for sleek kipao. The milky-eyed tailor who measures her wraps a knotted string around her bust and waist and hips. She used to work as a seamstress at her father's laundry when she was a child, she says. Afterwards, she shows off her new gowns for the camera, accessorizes with a jade cigarette holder. Going native, she tells Newsreel. In later years, she'll wear those dresses in movies and charge the studios an extra fee to rent her wardrobe. The decision to star in a movie of her own life proves an ill omen. She's greeted warmly at first in Shanghai. One newspaper describing her beauty speaks of her eyebrows like tender moth caterpillars, her eyes like kernels of apricots. She's feted by high society, flashbulbs sizzling in her wake. But there have long been disparaging murmurs, often from nationalist critics about her roles and their depiction of the Chinese. She is most famous for playing a prostitute in Shanghai Express, notorious for her scanty costume in The Thief of Baghdad. Those were only roles, she tries to explain, the only ones she could get. It was acting. But it's a hard distinction to make while a newsreel camera follows her everywhere, whirring gently in the background. Shameless, they call her at a film board banquet, lewd, a disgrace to Chinese womanhood, a Yankee puppet. She nods politely, smiles shyly, unsure of their Mandarin. Too American, newsreel translates tactfully. Her familial disgrace is now a national one. It's just acting, she repeats, but it's a hard distinction to make to a newsreel man. People believe what they see, he shrugs. I'd be out of work otherwise. In Hong Kong, perhaps drunk, perhaps feeling the strain, perhaps forgetting the Birdcage microphone is on, she insults the delegation that comes out to welcome her. A near riot ensues. A banner proclaiming her the flower of film is torn down. Garlands are crushed underfoot, their scent hanging heavy under the jostling crowd. Chicken, the mob bay, in Cantonese now, so she knows they're calling her a whore. It's Newsreel who pulls her away and hustles her into a cab. Thank you, she tells him. For just a moment, she had seen he was torn, wondering whether to keep filming. He offers her a cigarette, snaps his lighter in her face, snips it closed. Outside, coppery light filters through the banyans. In the breeze, their leaves shimmer like sequins on a dress. Subsequently, she's warned by the nationalist authorities not to travel inland to see her father until tempers cool. He is warned not to receive her on pain of deportation. Her friend and co-star in several pictures, Wagner Oland, is also in town. He played her father, Fu Manchu, in Daughter of the Dragon years earlier, and still calls her daughter, though when he played her coercive lover in Shanghai Express, he observed, "This is all getting a bit incestuous, no?" If she can't see her real father, she tells Newsreel glibly, she'll settle for her movie father. The show must go on. But she hopes Oland will help her too. He is the star of the Charlie Chan series, the most popular movies in China, and has been acclaimed on his own tour, despite an irony that pierces her to the quick, playing his most famous role in Yellowface. He's a Swede. Among friends goes by Jack, short for his real name, Johan. But the Chinese don't seem to mind or even to notice. They love Charlie Chan as a positive portrayal of a Chinese, no matter by whom. And in Oland's case, it doesn't hurt that he stays in character for interviews and appearances, answering to Mr. Chan and speaking of his pleasure at visiting a home of venerable ancestors. My bloody line, she thinks viciously. She should resent him. But he's been kind to her in the past, run lines with her and helped her hit marks, and she respects him. He's classically trained, has performed Shakespeare on stage and his own translations of Strindberg. She's hopeful he'll put in a good word for her with the authorities, help her on her way to her father. She arranges to meet him for dim sum. Oland, despite the boast that he's known as one-take Warner, is a famed drunk. The producers of the Charlie Chan pictures are said to encourage his boozing, thinking it adds to his character's air of serene geniality. So Warner claims, at least. He calls it his method. His favorite toast is action. She thinks dim sum will be too early for him to be drunk, but she's only half right. He arrives sober enough, but proceeds to drink through lunch, filling his teacup from a silver flask. Let's get in character, he says, raising it to Newsreel's camera. Rotten luck, he tells her, about the good earth. Louise just won the Academy Award for the Great Ziegfeld, you know. She'll probably win it for the good earth too, she complains. He's concentrating on his chopsticks. Probably. That should be my award. He laughs. But you wouldn't win it, daughter. Why not? I'd be better than her. He pauses to chase a slippery dumpling around his plate. Of course. And that's why you wouldn't win, don't you see? If she wins, it'll be for acting Chinese. You are Chinese. Take it from me. They don't hold it against me that I played Fu Manchu. That was acting. But you, they revile for playing his daughter. He gives a little sidelong glance around the restaurant to the other patrons staring at them. I act, she hisses, remembering how once at a party someone had asked her if inscrutability and acting weren't mutually exclusive. No, daughter, no. You are a star. What you always wanted to be, yes? To see your name in electric lights. Then don't complain. Stars don't act. They play themselves. That's why we love them, because they seem real, not fake. You can't blame people for confusing you and your parts. Ah, he finally spears the dumpling with his chopsticks. She pauses for the waiter to bring the next dish. He lifts the lid of the bamboo steamers with a little flourish, like doffing a hat. What about you, Jack? Aren't you a star? Oh, my dear, how kind of you. He dabs his greasy lips. But no, they don't cast stars in yellowface, don't you know? It spoils the illusion. Why do you think there are so many Europeans? We're not so recognizable. Besides, the Honourable Mr. Chan is star. I only humble servant. You no believe I can be replaced like... He snaps his fingers and a waiter looks over. Already there's talk of a Chinese language version of Chan. True, true. I met fellow who will play him. Play me, I should say, since he plans to impersonate my performance. A Chinaman playing a Swede, playing a Chinaman, Jack laughs. What'll they think of next? He applies himself to his dim sum. His cheeks are flushed, shiny, from the steam or drink she can't tell. Shu mai, he declares, remind him of Swedish meatballs, but he struggles to eat them. He's never mastered chopsticks. Mr. Chan, too busy detecting to eat. At one point he looks up at her across the table, steepling his fingers, channing it up as she's heard him describe it. Ah, very cunning plan, daughter, to remind fellow diners that Chan actor, not real Chinese. One might almost think you wish him lose face. He toasts her. Or yellow face, at least. She denies it, but he has the sly, satisfied look of a man who's cracked the case, the look that has made him an icon. In interviews later on his tour, when asked about his lunch with her, Mr. Chan will smile and bow and call her his number one daughter. G-pops, she says to herself, but she knows he's only trying to help. Her friend, the cinematographer James Wong Howe, calls them sticky tape actors on account of the makeup people's trick for slanting their eyes. Only Warner has never needed it, she tells Newsreel. Something to do with his Lap ancestry, at least that's what he tells the movie magazines. He just trims his eyebrows and smooths down the tips of his mustache, and he's passable. Newsreel looks dubious. He's a reporter, after all. His business is with the real, not the fake. But then what is he doing with her, she wonders. You'd be surprised, she tells him. Once on the set of Shanghai Express, a wizened grandpa, an extra, approached to ask if Warner had grown up in such and such a village, as if they might be old pals. She translated for them, explaining politely that Warner was Swedish, explaining politely what Swedish was. Warner all the time nodding and bowing and twinkling with amusement, acting, he'd crowed afterwards. That old grandpa was probably half blind, she thinks now, though at the time she had marveled at Warner, the alchemy of performance. Newsreel shakes his head. Not acting, he says, not sticky tape or trimmed eyebrows. It's you. Me? She smiles coyly, anticipating a gallantry. You make him Chinese. He stands next to you. He looks Chinese. You're his yellow face. At least Jack must have talked to the nationalist, she tells Newsreel. She has at last gotten permission to visit her father. That was me, Newsreel admits. He has influential friends who appreciate his work reporting on Japanese aggression in Mongolia. Thank you, she tells him with a stiff little bow to the camera. And do you share your friend's opinion of my acting, she wonders. Do you think, he asks, setting the camera aside, even if you were the best actress in the world, you would be allowed to play white roles? He winds the camera brutally, raises it again as if awaiting her response. She can hear the film running, but she can't think of her lines. Beneath the black box, all she can see of him is his mouth, the cigarette jutting to one side so that smoke doesn't float in front of the lens. It twitches slightly. Thank you. Let me make my way discreetly over to you, Twyla. All righty.
Oh, such rich material.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So thank you for reading and for writing this exquisite tale and set of tales. I have so many questions. I have a very well-thumbed copy and
I'd love
many
to see
notes.
a dog-eared and post-it noted copy.
Happy to share later. I'm going to start with Pearl Buck and the Good Earth, and that could possibly be a role of a lifetime. And also the irony of Pearl Buck writing a story about a Chinese man, really, and his family, and the role that was, you know, all of the main actors, of course, end up being white in Yellowface, but the role that she wanted to be a mother, and she wanted to be what is written as a very boring, self-sacrificing, completely humiliated on all levels person. And what she was so daring and so different from that. And then there's her father again, you know, wanting her in many ways to be that person and not accepting. Tell me about the quote. So at the very beginning, you didn't read it, but you start with Pearl Buck. And I'll read it. "The truth is always exciting. Speak it then. Life is dull without it."
Yeah. Well, I think the quote, you know, and I'm a sucker for epigraphs on books in general. And a book like this, that's made up of 4 sections, allows me to indulge my pleasure in lots of different titles and lots of different epigraphs. So I got to sort of lean into that space in lots of fun ways. And one of the things the book is interested in, I think, broadly, is that negotiation between fact and fiction, which of course is true for me as a historical novelist writing about real characters, but to some degree is also true, of course, for Anna May Wong as an actress playing into these roles. There's a sense of performance, there's a sense of where does the reality give over to the fiction. And that's particularly true for a figure like her, who's essentially playing representational roles and is being cast for those roles to some degree because of her apparent reality, even if the roles themselves are very fictionalized in some ways. So those paradoxes in the Pearl Buck quote felt really appropriate in those regards. There's another moment, I think, later in that section that I didn't get to in that part of the reading, where Pearl Buck herself, later in her own writing life, I think when she was writing into radio plays, would sometimes describe a character as an Anna May Wong type. So there's another strange circularity of role, persona, somehow coming back into that space of being typecast in a certain sense, right? To be used as a kind of shorthand for the kind of role, the kind of performance that ought to be given in a place like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and such a liminal existence, so not Chinese, not American, both Chinese and American, and going back and forth. And I was struck again in the part that you were reading about you'll never be cast as in a white actress's part. Tell me about how you came to really write about Anna May Wong and that dilemma.
It's really interesting, actually. I sort of stumbled into the material. The book, although I'm very happy with the way it turned out, like most of my novels, is something of a struggle and a kind of feeling one's way into the material. So the first section of the book is about the Chinese working on the Transcontinental Railroad. I was really interested in that material. It was the first glimmer of the book for me. I think actually probably only a couple of years after I first came to the US, so 25, 30 years ago now, I had taken a train ride all the way from Boston out west, which is a long way to go. Really eye-opening for somebody coming from Europe to get a sense of the continental scale of the US as a country. That was a really interesting experience to have. And I'd been very struck as I sort of passed and getting close to the end of the journey, thank goodness, as we passed over the Sierra Nevadas and learning about the Chinese who'd worked on the railroad, particularly over that stretch. And so from quite early on in my time here, very early on in my writing life, I'd had an interest in writing that material. It'd taken me a while to get to it and be ready to write about it. And initially when I wrote this book, I thought that would be the novel, that a character that I follow who sort of works for one of the railroad barons, and is sort of loosely based on a historical figure who, in a sense, has this odd position where he sort of inspires the man he works for as a kind of houseboy or valet. He inspires him by saying, well, the Chinese are strong. They could be used as labor on this railroad, somewhat against the stereotype at the time that the Chinese weren't strong enough to undertake that back-breaking labor. So I was really interested in that situation. And then about 100 or 120 pages into that portion of the book, the material sort of stopped on me. And I think mostly because that character, for his own reasons, decides that he wants to step out of the spotlight, that he no longer wants to be responsible for history, he no longer wants to be representative of his people, because he feels, despite the fact that he might have represented Chinese strength or manliness in some ways, that then having 10,000 of his countrymen hired onto the very dangerous and backbreaking work of the railroad is maybe not a great outcome in that circumstance. So he steps away, I think, from both the pride but also the burden, the equivocation of being a representative.
And I love how you did that in the novel, where he literally becomes one of them.
Yeah, right. So he steps back into the mass, into the crowd, rather than to be exceptional, I think, in some ways. But that posed me a problem for the novel, because I was like, I need you on stage for another couple of 100 pages. And he steadfastly and quite appropriately refused to re-enter the history of the narrative. And so I was sounding around for thinking about how to continue the book. And I think maybe it's that link, that idea that he is a representative figure, that made me think about Anna May Wong, whose story I'd been somewhat conscious of as sort of first Chinese-American movie star. But it felt as though the bridge there was that they are both firsts, in a way. Ah Ling, who works for Charles Crocker, the railroad baron, is essentially the first Chinese person hired by the railroad, even before there's a railroad. Anna May Wong is sort of the first Chinese-American movie star. And I think that burden of being a first, the burden of representation, and the impossibility of representation, right? How does one person stand for a community, stand for a culture, stand for a people? Felt as though it was a link between the two of them, I think, in various ways. What I gradually learned as I worked my way through the book, and probably this only came in maybe the last third or so of the work, was trying to find out why I was drawn to these figures who were struggling with questions of representation. And of course, as the last section of the book begins to acknowledge, that's a writerly anxiety as well. How do I, as a writer, try to speak to Chinese or Chinese-American experience when I'm half Chinese and probably less than half culturally Chinese? So I think all writers have this anxiety about how do I represent or speak for a community. And I think these characters, by struggling with those very issues themselves, are in a sense echoes of my own concerns and anxieties in that regard as well. So, you know, rather than let the concerns stop me writing, I think I try to dramatize the concerns and write into those concerns via these characters.
Wonderful. It's wonderful for me to think about, too, as aspiring. So how did the four pieces decide that they were going to become one? And what do you call it? It's clearly a book. Is it a novel? Is it four novellas? Is it?
I'm looking at the cover now, and it does say a novel on there. And
I struggle with it because it feels that it is a novel, and yet the stories are. I remember when I first read it, I was looking for this character Along to show up again, or Anna May Wong to show up, or to try and figure out what the thread was, and yet there is a very clear unconscious thread in it.
Yeah. You know, and I thought a lot into these questions myself as I was writing it, not least because I was under contract to write a novel, so it felt like I should keep telling them it's a novel, thinking it into it being a novel. How do I make it more like a novel? And being aware that it did feel like it could be seen as four novellas, maybe thematically connected, but how do we think into this space of them as a novel? I think a couple of things occurred to me, again, late on, trying to think about why this is the right form to tell this story. One was this idea that one way of thinking about this book would be to think of it as a multi-generational novel. We start with Chinese and the railroad in the 1860s, we move to Anna May Wong in the 30s, Vincent Chin is in Detroit in the 80s, the last section sort of brings us closer to the present moment. And when we think about a traditional multi-generational novel, we might imagine, you know, starting similarly maybe a century ago with grandparental characters, right? Maybe characters who are immigrants to the country, we can think of those narratives, and then we might see the next generation born into that space and a more recent generation. And this book, I think, replicates some of that structure, but speaks into what I think of as one of the struggles of the Chinese and Chinese American community in the US, which is that those lines of lineage are often broken. So when the Chinese arrive to work on the railroad or work in the gold fields, they're often thought of as a bachelor society, predominantly men. Women are not allowed to come. They cannot bring families. The only women who do come are coming as prostitutes, essentially. There are anti-miscegenation laws, as we talked about in the case of the Anna May Wong situation. So it feels as though historically there have been political forces ranged against the idea of a Chinese family coming as an immigrant and having this intergenerational process. So in a way, there's a sense of this is an intergenerational novel, but where the blood ties are constantly interrupted and severed, so that there is a sense of generations, but maybe not a sense of this person is a direct descendant of that person, although they are, I think, thematically, culturally, experientially descendants of those who come before them, I think, in various ways.
So that's leading me to ask about your next novel, biographies. Again, struggling with form here. Title escapes me.
A lie someone told you about yourself.
Right, lies someone told you about yourself. So that deals with adoption, and it deals with a Chinese American going.
Oh, sorry, you're thinking about the final section, The Fortunes, yes. So that is Disorientation, that last section. I was thinking about the more recent novel.
Yeah, no, I wanted to go there too, right, yeah. But, just kind of continuing that process and looking at it, I wanted to ask you what you thought of this moment and where just this moment and how that's going to work its way out. Maybe there's already a contract there, but it seems to me that there's so much richness in this moment of identity and working through those identities and new awarenesses that at the same time when we look back at Anna May Wong and we look back at the 20s and the, all of these things that you wrote about, those awarenesses were there and somehow they got lost. They got cut off. So I'm curious about what you're working on now and whether that's found its way into your work.
That's a good question. Currently, I would struggle to describe what I'm doing as working on anything. I have the glimmering gleams of an idea, but nothing on paper yet. And I'm going to rest on my laurels of having published 2 books this year and say I'm going to allow myself some time in those regards. It's interesting, though, that you talk about thinking into identity and continuing to think into identity, which has been something that I've written about in various connotations through several books now. The novel before this is my novel, The Welsh Girl, which thinks a little bit into my father's background and to some degree my own relationship to Welshness. I think people occasionally think of me as an expert on Welshness. And what I always tend to say is I wouldn't have written that book if I felt like an expert on Welshness. I'm writing that book to try and understand my own relationship to it, to write into that unknown, to sort of try and claim what I can of it in some ways. And to some degree, I think The Fortunes comes from that space as well. It's not coming from a space of expertise in my sense of my Chineseness, such as it is, but trying to negotiate or explore my relationship to that identity. And I suppose this also goes back to that question of form you were asking. Is it a novel? Is it a collection of stories? I think the other way I think about that is some part of the trajectory for the characters in the book, and indeed some part of the trajectory for my own thinking about identity as I move through the book, is that movement from the either-orness of Chinese or American, and maybe even sometimes the neither-nor-ness, not one thing nor the other, but maybe it was a movement towards an idea of bothness. And that third thing, in a sense I always feel like I'm writing into the hyphen in the hyphenated identity in various ways, eventually feels like it is something in its own right. It has a value in its own right. It's not lesser than either of the two things. In fact, it's maybe a commingling of those things. And so formally, the book is maybe neither a novel nor a collection, maybe both. So I feel that there's something about the hybridity of the form that speaks to the hybridity of identity that I was kind of interested in. None of this, I should say, is consciously in mind as I'm working my way through the book, but I think very often in the latter stages of the book, we're trying to read our own work back to understand it and sort of justify to ourselves, why did it take this form? What about this form that feels intuitively right can I understand rationally sort of as I'm moving through the latter stages of the book? So that's one of the ways I thought into that. And it did, I think, for me, personally, it brought a degree of peace to a question of identity that had been troubling and dogging me for the first 50 years of my life, I think, in many ways. So there's a part of me that thinks that some elements of that identity question feel a little less urgent to me personally, although I appreciate they're very much present in our culture still going forward. And so what I've noticed, same with my more recent novel, that there the interrogation of identity feels more around questions of gender and gender roles. So I think it's still some of that same topic, but it's maybe moved some of its ground in various ways.
So we have a great question from one of our listeners, and I want to follow up on that gender thing too, because I have been thinking about things in a certain way, but I want to read a question from Roland Wong.
Oh, sure. Roland, great.
Who says, it's also a writing and research process question. And so the question was your research and writing of the novellas or parts done in parallel tracks or sequentially?
Oh, that's a very good question. And I'm pretty sure this is Roland, who is thanked in the back of the book and who helped me with some of the research, because I talked to him about the Vincent Chin case, which he is much more expert on than I am, of course. And I would say that while I'm sure in revision there was some overlap as I worked on the book as a whole, they were written fairly sequentially. The difference probably, or the difference in the order in which I worked on the book and the order in which the sections appear is that worked on the railroad section first, worked on the anime Wagner section second, always knew I was going to work on the final section which touches upon adoption from China. At the end, I'm a godfather of a young woman who was adopted from China. And while it's not based on her or her mother's experience, it felt like I'd been interested in that topic for a long time, and it felt as though it would be a very interesting bookend to think of that largely male bachelor society that comes with the gold rush, and to think about a wave of immigration that's largely female babies being brought to the US. So I always had that in mind. But the third section, the Vincent Chin section, was, I think, the fourth written. And there was a point at which I thought the book was done with the three sections that didn't include that. But I think late on it began to feel as though it was a section that felt urgent to me. It felt like there had been tension, there were suggestions of violence elsewhere in the text, but we hadn't quite confronted that space. I was also really interested in writing a section that was a little closer to our own temporal space, that sort of bridged that space between the 1930s and the contemporary moments of the 80s, felt really interesting in those regards. And of course, the proximity between where I am in Ann Arbor and where this attack took place in Detroit felt very compelling to me as well as I thought into that space. So it began to feel late in the construction of the book that section felt like an urgent addition to be made into the book. So that was what came along at that stage. And one of the reasons I know that all these sections are written sequentially, I should say, is that my writing routine in those years relied upon the fact that my teaching at UM finishes usually around the middle of April, and my son, who was then sort of a middle schooler, finished school in mid-June. So somewhere between the end of my teaching and the end of his schooling, there were 2 or 3 months of what I thought of as golden time for writing. And each of the last 3 sections of the book was drafted in that 3-month period, and then revised through the rest of the year, get back again to the middle of April, write another section. So that's kind of how I worked my way through the book.
Thank you, and thank you, Roland, for asking that. So, revising.
Oh, yes.
So your most recent book, which out yet? Not quite?
It's out, I think, next week, November
Next,
4th.
it's coming. I've pre-ordered.
Oh, thank you. I should have brought you a copy. Sorry about that.
Oh, well. So revision. I want to, actually, goes to form again. And one of the things that I love about your writing is your use of mixing of languages, mixing of jargon, the part that you read about the Hollywood 1920s jargon where you're just going on and on and on. Speak American, because that didn't even sound American to me, even though it was so deeply American. But there are also sections in this part of it, the silver part of it, the silver screen, where you use repetition so stunningly and hauntingly. So she turned heads, she turned heads, she turned heads. She taught so-and-so how to use chopsticks, how to use chopsticks, how to use chopsticks. He filmed her, he filmed her. He filmed her. Tell me a little bit about your revising process. So as a prelude, perhaps, to the book as well, what does it mean to you to write a draft in 2 months and then to revise over the rest of the year?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny, though, because when I think about the Anime Wong section, maybe because I had struggled with the transcontinental section, wanting to sort of force it on beyond the point that I think it had come to a natural conclusion, and had been sort of in the doldrums with it, trying to make it work for the best part of a year or two without success, that when I was able to turn to the Anime Wong section, it felt like freedom. And that material came fairly swiftly to me, I think. One of the ways that I recall about the writing now is that I looked online at all the images of her that are out there, and there are hundreds of them. I read some interesting biographies as well, of course. She's very well documented. But the photographs were incredibly inspiring because each of them felt like a moment. And I think something of the kind of vignette style of this, each short section, each moment, felt almost as though I was animating a particular photograph that I'd seen or springing from that. So it almost felt as though, I think there's a reference to a scrapbook in there, but it almost felt as though there was a kind of album that was being assembled. And so the pleasure of that was just to write, each section felt like it can do its own little quanta of work. And I think the repetition comes in a little bit because you're trying to think about how do you stitch these together? How do these sequence of dozens of small sections of the story feel as though they call back to each other, and they build up a rhythm amongst themselves, but occasionally there are callbacks between them as well that assures the reader that there's a kind of shapeliness to this, that these pieces are intentionally put together and that they build hopefully a little bit of momentum along the way as well. And it was that in mind, I think, that made me think of the question of revision you're thinking about. Some part of what I was doing was also thinking about how do these sections speak to each other? How do images bounce from one to the other? So there's a moment in, and I love this, again, a question of terminology, right? Period language. There was an idea during the gold rush that when you were going out to the gold fields, you were going to go and see the elephant, right? It's a phrase, a bit of terminology from that period. It sort of dropped into disuse, but feels fascinating, mysterious. And even why that phrase comes into being is a little disputed, right? Maybe the idea of going to the gold fields just to go see this wonderful thing, this wondrous, huge thing, the elephant. Maybe it comes, I think there was even some sense of it coming from earlier in the Civil War, that to go to the war, if you were a Union soldier, was to go and see the gray enemy, go and see the elephant, the Confederate forces in various ways. So I'm not sure about that. I think it's sort of always interesting to me, especially when these etymologies are not particularly decided, because then you can make them up in certain ways. But the image of an elephant recurs at various points. I think there's a moment where Anime Wong sees a statue of an elephant in China and learns that throwing a stone onto its head is a kind of act of fertility. So she leans into that space, so that image echoes through the course of the text. Of course, later on when they're adopting the baby, I think there's a toy elephant that plays a small part in that narrative. So there's little callbacks and echoes which are about playing into the readers and rewarding the reader's attention and memory. For readers, and I say this myself as a reader when I enjoy this in books as a reader, they feel like readerly equivalents of moments of inspiration, right? So the writer enjoys those moments, then these are readerly equivalents of those spaces, I think, along the way as well. And then maybe the last thing where revision is concerned, I make a bid in the book to redeem the idea or make more gentle the idea of killing our darlings, this idea that beautiful things in our text, sometimes are the things we're most attached to, we should get rid of them. And I make a bid for saving them. I think I have an odd idea in my brain that everything I ever write will eventually form part of a large jigsaw for the sake of argument. And as we all know, when we do a jigsaw, sometimes we try and jam a piece of, it's blue, it'll be in the sky, I'll jam it in there. It doesn't fit. But of course, we don't, with the jigsaw, throw that piece away, right? That would be the equivalent of killing our darlings. We save it until we're working on, here's the ocean part that I'm doing, and actually that piece now fits in there. And every so often, a piece that I cut somewhere will find its rightful home somewhere else. So even within the context of the 4 parts of the Fortunes, I wanted desperately for my guys working on the Transcontinental Railroad to eventually have a kind of picaresque adventure and sort of become bank robbers, or become train robbers, actually, right? So I had a whole Western, I used to love Westerns when I was a kid. I had a whole worked out trajectory for that. It probably didn't work because I think tonally it wasn't quite right for that character. But I granted that plot to the writer who shows up in the 4th section of the book and has a cockamamie job writing, I think, novelizations of the Kung Fu TV series, a job I was offered at one point many years ago, I should say. And he works that plot point that I couldn't work in to the first part of the book. He gets to resuscitate that and work it into one of the novels that he's working on in a kind of pulp way. And I always love that sense of these bits that we love that we can't quite make work. They do often find a home somewhere else in the work. And it makes it easier to cut them in one place, knowing they might come in handy somewhere else.
Yeah, I have a couple of those sitting in a drawer.
We
Cherry
all do.
pie. I have a narrative about cherry pie.
And one of these days, you're going to find the right place.
I know I will, but it's just sitting there. So we're getting close to time. I invite you to please type in more questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep asking my questions. But since I'm not seeing one, I will ask one more. And it has to do with the transition that you mentioned in your next, and again, form. Is it biography? Is it novel? Is it fiction? Is it, which I think, it's trite to say it, but all fiction is always about the author and all of these unworked, bizarre things that as a experimental research psychologist I can't talk about. We let those hang out in your department. But the thing that really stuns me, and I'm curious on the fact that you went from a cultural identity, and I love how you talked about bothness and noneness, to talking about gender and exploration of gender identity and gender roles. And one of the things I've been talking a lot about with my students and colleagues my age is about gender identities and gender pronouns. So pronouns, I teach language, pronouns are considered closed class items. They typically don't change in a language, and yet they're either or. They're kind of the one drop rule for language. So you have millions of different names in the world, but when you get to pronouns, you have very little choice. And we're struggling right now as a society and multiple societies with the fact that gender can be a continuum. And there are all different ways to think about gender identity, gender role. And so what I think about, and what I've tried to explain to friends of mine who struggle with the whole pronoun issue, is it is a lot like culture. We're never all one or all another. We might identify as one or another, but it depends on the moment, it depends on the context. There's language, there's what you eat, there's your personality, there's what you look like, there's all these different aspects. And so I am really curious how you went, and this is probably the one book we haven't talked about very much, is Lies. So Lies Someone Told You. So
yeah, I mean, so there are a lot of things, floating around in the background of that book. The formal place, you were beginning to allude to it earlier, is that it's a novel, but it's sort of in that weird liminal zone of autofiction. So some of it feels like it's coming from life, some of it is fictionalized. I like to think of it, some of the parts as being true, but the whole as being fiction. But it also starts with an uncertain genetic diagnosis. And in a certain sense, the uncertainty is this fact, is this fiction that the form suggests is a way of modeling for the reader the uncertainty of what does this diagnosis mean and how do we interpret it, that the characters who wish to be parents have to struggle with at the start of that book as well. So I'm always interested in that sense of form and subject sort of coming together, I think, in various ways. And again, often it feels like I learn that I figure it out intuitively and then have to figure it out rationally, sometimes after the fact. And as to the questions about gender, which are very well taken and very much of the moment, of course, as well. I mean, I'm thinking a little bit there into questions of parenthood and fatherhood, also questions of appropriation, not just for a father to write about parenthood, but a father also to write into questions of abortion in this particular case as well. And I hope the book is wrestling with those questions, not necessarily arriving at answers for everybody. I feel like I hopefully worked my way through towards some answers for myself in the writing of the book. But it's funny, when we think about, say, pronouns, I was talking to an older friend about this back in Britain, not an academic, sort of family friend recently. And often in these conversations, particularly when we're talking to sort of older friends, somebody's going to say, oh, it's all this PC stuff, and we default to this space. And I just said, doesn't it feel like just decency to call somebody what they want to be called? That, that feels like the older word for PC, right? And so in that basic sense, it just feels like decency. But in a basic way, too, I think a lot of my books about identity have thought into this, certainly in the context of The Fortunes and even in The Welsh Girl. I'm really interested in the struggle between the self that we think we are, the self that we try to project out into the world, and the way the world tells us who we are, right? We might construe that to be a kind of an opposition, almost a binary, right? And I think there is some of that the world is telling me I'm this, but I'm trying to tell the world I'm that, and there is a kind of push-pull in those spaces. But it's also, I think, true, and one of the ways I've reconciled this to some degree for myself is that we have, all of us, I think, multiple identities, right? We're used to this idea of code switching. The way I am on stage, even talking about a book that I've written, is not the way I am when I write the book. A book that might touch on family material is not the way that I lived that family material. The person I am teaching is not the person who goes home to dinner with my family, and is not the person who talks to my child, is not the person who talks to my mother, right? There are all these different ways in which we negotiate. I think one of the great anxieties for all of us is, which is me? Which is the authentic one, right? And I think that can be a tricky burden to be in. Even though we kind of assume sometimes when we're interacting with people who are our intimates that that person is the authentic, right? I think my wife would like to think, oh, that's the authentic Peter that's interacting with her. Probably my son would like to think that that's the authentic dad who's interacting with him. But those are slightly different people, slightly different personas. So there's a part of me, there's no singular authenticity. We are multiply authentic, that the selves we project outwards are not all false performances. They are just versions of the self. And I think sort of trying to accept that also means that it doesn't feel exactly like it's me versus what's being projected onto me projecting one thing out. It's me projecting many things out to it. And that feels almost as though it gives me a little bit more flexibility in some ways as well. This is becoming a little esoteric and abstract in various ways, but I'm trying to think my way out of the box of identity that people might choose to put me in, I think.
Yeah, I think it ties really nicely with the quote that we started with from your novel. I'm gonna, I think it's probably time we should be wrapping up, but one last one that does have to do with identity, and that I wasn't sure until, and I highly recommend, I just watched the short film Anime Wong in Her Own Words, and Noel Coward gets brought up. And I actually had an occasion recently to see the Noel Coward play that was written in Shanghai, which is just so bizarre to think about it as being written in Shanghai. But the quote that you have in this book and the song, I didn't realize it was like really the lyrics. I'm trying to find it, of course, now I can't. If you could recall it for me, that's the
song is called
here it is,
Half-Caste
Half-Caste
Woman.
Woman.
Yeah, right.
Yes, Half-Caste Woman. What are you?
your slanting eyes, waiting and hoping to see. Ouch.
Yes, it's odd that I had to pay money to use those lyrics
Oh,
in the book,
gosh.
and yet it felt inescapable, partly as a way of thinking about her cultural presence. That fame of hers, I think, is sometimes forgotten, the kind of global fame, and the way she rubs shoulders with all these figures. But it's also a way of thinking into, a figure like Noel Coward, who feels like a charming historical figure, is also bound up in the biases of his time, and she's on the receiving end of those things, right? And also trying to live and negotiate her way through those spaces as well. And sort of being embroiled within them. She's also representing them, right? She's making her living to some degree by trading in those stereotypes as well. So it's a very complicated space. I don't judge her negatively for that, because I'm not sure that she had that many choices. And maybe that's the way to think about this, right? That it would be easy to look back in time and judge Coward, or even judge Anna May Wong, from our privileged position in time. The thing, maybe as a father, I think into this, and at the age I'm now at, I think into this. But we will all be judged by those who come after us, right? There's a great quote actually from my physics days. I think it's an idea that, if Newton was great, it's because he stood on the shoulders of giants, right? And I do think there's something to be said for that those who've come before us are flawed, very often deeply flawed, and we recognize those flaws, but we have also stood on their shoulders. They may not be giants, that might be too much of a way of thinking about this, but we've stood on the shoulders of those who've come before us in various ways. So to judge them, we are able to judge them because we stand on their shoulders in some form or other.
I think that's a perfect way to wrap this up, and to also remind ourselves, all of us, that, even 2 years ago, pre-COVID, it was a different world, and that we are constantly learning. And I really loved how you really put into a fictional place, taking from real people and helping us see that so vividly. And I hope that other people's readings, as well as my own, can help us to really see that in our everyday lives. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the questions as well. That was great from the audience and for you as well.
So, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.